Okay, so I'm just going to open today with a question. How many of you enjoy baking? We just come from lunch. Okay, so you have a few bakers in the audience. How many of you have ever put something into the oven only to have it come out completely different from what you imagined? Anybody had that happen? Okay. Yeah, this happens a lot, right? What about when you're working with an agency? So all of us have probably worked with agencies, and you brief that agency on a creative idea, and something comes back that's totally different than what you imagined. Has anybody had that happen? Okay, so most of the people in the audience, right? So it turns out this happens a lot with agencies. So where our expectations of how things should look end up being very different from how things actually look in the end. And so today I'm here to talk to you about how to make the most of your client-agency relationships, how to manage your agencies more effectively. And the reason why this is important is because you've heard today there are so many fast-developing progressions in marketing, and with the advent of digital marketing and mobile advertising, the pace of marketing is becoming much faster. So the slack time in working with agencies has been reduced, and there's less time for inefficiencies. So managing your agencies efficiently and effectively is much more important right now. So today I'm going to talk about how you can do this more effectively so you can avoid situations like this, where you have something in your mind and something totally different comes back. And specifically what we're going to talk about are three things. So the brief, the pitch, and the work. So these are three very common aspects of the agency management process. So I'm presuming that, let's pretend for today that you're bringing in a new agency, you're briefing them on a new piece of work, and your intent is to select from a variety of agencies and bring them in to then actually complete the project. Okay, so that's what we're going to be covering today, these three pieces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the common tendencies that we have as clients and some of the bad habits we have as clients, and offer up some alternative ways that you can manage your agencies, which will hopefully be more effective and hopefully transform them into being true strategic partnerships. Now, before I get into that, I should probably tell you a little bit about me. So again, my name is Joseph Liu. I have a passion for helping people reignite their careers. And so I'm a full-time coach, a certified coach through the International Coach Federation. But prior to that, I spent most of my career as a brand marketer. So about 10 years, I started off in corporate branding. I worked at both small and large Fortune 500 companies. As Simon mentioned, I started off marketing a brand called Glad. It was a bin liner brand. And then I went from there to Liquid Plumber Drain Opener. And then I moved to the UK, and it got a lot better. I worked for Goo Puddings, and then most recently was the Senior Brand Manager of Global Strategy and Communications for Häagen-Dazs. I remain involved in marketing. I write a column for the drum marketing magazine called Career Advice for Marketers, and I also enjoy giving public talks and spoken at TEDx and Cancer Research UK, and also Marketing Week. So that's a little bit about me. In terms of today's talk, what informs today's talk is probably two things. So first of all, my own experiences as a client-side brand manager, because I've spent my entire career client-side. And then the other is from soliciting some input from a variety of agencies, some of whom you see here on the screen, and just soliciting their input on what has worked well and what hasn't worked well for you when you're working with some of your best clients and some of your worst clients. And I'm going to try to capture some of those themes today so that hopefully when you go back to each of your companies and you're working with your agencies, you can take some of these tips and insights and hopefully manage the agencies more effectively. And if there's kind of three things I'd ask you to kind of take away from today, these are kind of the major themes that I've kind of seen myself and also heard from agencies, and that's to be clear, to be concise, and to be consistent in everything you do. And if you do these three things, that's a great foundation for having a solid relationship with your agency. So I'd encourage you to remember these three things if you take nothing else away from the rest of my talk. But let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about the briefing process, okay? So all of us in this room have probably been through a briefing process. This is where you're taking an idea and you're briefing this out to multiple agencies. You've got a specific objective in mind, and this is kind of the start of what is typically a competitive pitch process. Now, what tends to happen is that we as clients, we're all marketing managers or marketing directors or brand managers, and when it comes to the brief, we have this tendency of suddenly changing job titles. And what I mean by that is we try to cram as much as we possibly can into the brief. So the tendency is for us to become litigators with our brand truths, and we become rocket scientists with our launch plans, and we put that into the brief. We become psychologists, and we talk about our consumer insights. We also talk about being architects with our product pillars. It doesn't stop there. We also talk about our company history, so we become historians, we become botanists with our growth ideas, and we become cartographers with our roadmaps. And we take all this stuff and we cram it into the brief. And the question is, what's wrong with that approach? Because it's typically what happens. Oftentimes, this content's coming from maybe an existing deck that you presented internally. And the question is, what's wrong with this approach? Well, the problem is complete and utter confusion. So when a creative team receives this sort of a brief, they don't know where to start. And this is one of the most common complaints I hear from agencies, is that the briefs coming from clients are all over the place. There's no focus to them whatsoever. So the good news is there is another way. And I've got 3 ideas I'd love to share with you today and encourage you to consider as a different way of working with your agency. And the first is to be brief. Okay, now this is a concept that I read about from a company called Slide Comet, and this is from a presentation called Great Presentations Are Like Ads. And so I've got a pair of Superman briefs up here, and the question is, what do briefs do? What do these kinds of briefs do? Well, they cover what's important. And so similarly, with a regular brief, we want to cover what's important and only what's important. So things like the budget, the key timelines, the key objectives, but to kind of stay away from putting everything possible into the brief, but focusing on those key nuggets that really matter. And one of the things that one creative director told me, which I thought was really useful, was she said, if you put garbage into the brief, you're almost guaranteed to get garbage back out. So the quality of your brief and the simplicity of your brief is really key to driving the results that you want in terms of the quality creative that you get back. The second is to be creative with the brief. Okay, now just one point before I move on to that. This slide is to kind of capture the idea that a brief can be very concise. So you can challenge yourself to think about, okay, if I were to boil this brief down to 15 words or less, what would it look like? How could I read that out? Because in order to be that concise, you'll have to know exactly what it is you're looking for. One of the brands I used to work on was called Goo, and one time I remember for a packaging brief, it was a 1-word brief, and it was decadence. We want decadence to come through on the packaging, and that's it. And I think that that is a challenge for you as you're briefing. How simple can you make it? Now, this is an example from Mr. Clean, and the brief was to get consumers to believe that Mr. Clean can clean the toughest stains. And that was it. And so you can see the crosswalk. I think it's quite compelling. And it shows how clear you can be with a very short brief. On to the next point was to be creative with the brief. And this is a concept about moving away from just written briefs and long documents into using different sorts of briefs. So Kim Snow is one of the creative directors that works with Google. And one thing that she says is the importance of a brief being a thing. So having that thing, whether it's a word or an object, represent the mantra or the holistic kind of vision of that brand. So I'll show you an ad. This is kind of an old ad. It's kind of debated about whether to put in, but I think aside from what you think about the ad, there's a point about how the briefing went, which I think is very interesting. So I will play this ad. This is an ad from, I think, 2011, so kind of antique in these days, but see, I've just lost the mouse here. I think we have no audio. You want me to stop it, or? There's not a lot of audio anyway. Well, oh, just music. Okay, so again, I wouldn't say that's my favorite ad, but the reason why I show it is because the story behind the briefing process is really interesting. So what happened, the story goes that the creative director met with the marketing director, and when the marketing director was briefing in the creative team, marketing director walked in with 2 objects in his hand. He walked in with a box of Kellogg's cereal, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and he walked in with an alarm clock. And he took the alarm clock and he slammed it down on the table, and it rang. And he said, I want you to connect that sound with this box, and that's your brief. And that was it. And I thought that was a really interesting example of how clear you can be without even using a written brief. But I want to connect this trigger in the morning with this box of cereal. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. If you kind of think about your own brands, what is one object, you don't have to answer right now, but as you kind of go back to your teams, what is one object that represents the essence of how consumers feel when they use your brand? And if there is one object, what would that be? And could you maybe you don't walk in with just that object in your next briefing, but maybe you bring it. Maybe you give them a sense of what your consumers like, because this object is what they love to interact with. Anyway, it's just something to think about in kind of a different way of briefing. The final suggestion I have for the briefing is to be clear with your expectations. Now, that is really about clarity, and there's a guy named Seth Godin, which I think most of you, how many of you have heard of Seth Godin? He wrote The Purple Cow. Okay, so everybody in this room has heard of Seth Godin. For those of you who haven't, he wrote The Purple Cow. He's a very well-known brand thought leader. He also wrote something called the Ship It Journal, which is kind of a lesser-known document, and it talks about the importance of the briefing process when you're kicking off a project, and specifically what some key questions are that you should be addressing that most people don't address in the briefing process. So questions like, what's hard about this project? So we all have these projects we want to bring to creative teams, but we're bringing them to them because they're challenging. So helping the creative team understand what's challenging about this is a really good way to start. What does good enough look like on this project? What would be acceptable? And what does fantastic look like on this project? And giving them a clear sense of that difference is useful. What's a specific budget that's involved? What is the drop-dead date when this has to be finished? And very importantly, I've talked to a few people here who work at very large organizations. Who are the stakeholders that need to be involved in the process, and at what specific stages of the process do we need to bring them in? Helping them understand that from the very start is a great way to get the briefing off to a good start. Okay, so three ideas on the briefing. So be brief, be creative with the brief, and be clear on your expectations within the brief. So, assuming you've done all that, now we are moving on to the pitch process. So this, again, let's pretend like you're running a pitch process, a competitive pitch process, where you're bringing in a new agency that you haven't worked with before. Maybe you have 5 to 10 lined up, and you want to see how they fare against one another. So you've sent your brief out to multiple agencies, and now it's kind of over to them to come back with their response. Now, what is the tendency? What I've seen the tendency is for most clients is to kind of just sit back and take a passive approach. So you've thrown your brief out there, you kind of lobbed it over to these agencies, and at this point, you're not involved anymore, and you're just kind of seeing what you can catch. The other thing is that clients can be very hands-off, so you kind of just kick back, you move on to your other projects, you're not involved. If they call you, you don't respond to their questions. And this creates an issue because by the time the agency then comes to pitch their ideas to you, what can happen is they've invested a lot of time and effort and money in coming up with these great ideas. You've had no contact. They come and they do the big reveal. Maybe you go into the room with the big curtains in the agency. That's happened to me before. And they put all this effort in. They pitch their great idea. And as a client, maybe you're told to do this, or maybe you just naturally do this. You kind of sit back and they're completely poker-faced. And then the agency walks away. They have no idea how they've done. And then you leave them hanging. Because maybe you have a few other agencies lined up who you haven't seen yet. Or maybe the timing of the responses to the brief are coming in at different times of the month. And so you've got this agency that's just kind of left there hanging while you're still seeing new ideas come in. And every day that goes by, they're starting to lose more and more motivation. That enthusiasm starts to kind of dip. I coach a lot of people in their careers and career transitions, and one thing I always tell people to do is when you receive an offer, accept it as soon as you know that you want to accept it. Because what happens is every day you let that delay, the employer ends up losing enthusiasm. Similarly with agencies, I've seen 2-4 weeks go by before we get back to an agency. And they find that very demotivating from what I've heard. And so the good news is that there is another way. I mean, this is an issue because everybody loses in this situation. Everybody loses because I've got a picture here of a dirty flat. So how many of you have ever been to a flat that you were going to rent and it ended up being a little bit dirtier than you expected? Anybody ever have that happen? Okay, so it's definitely happened to me here a few times. And this kind of illustrates a point that someone has mentioned to me, a former director at a very large agency in London, of moral hazard. And for those of you who aren't familiar with moral hazard, it's basically a situation where the risks involved or the bad outcomes don't end up landing on you, they end up landing on somebody else, and so you end up taking on kind of riskier behavior. So it's kind of like when you're renting a sports car or if you're letting a flat. You don't take as good care of that flat or that car as you would if it belonged to you or if it's something that you owned. And similarly in the pitch process, very rarely are clients paying for agencies to pitch. There's no money involved, there's no skin in the game, and therefore this moral hazard creeps up where clients tend to get very sloppy with how they manage the agencies. And so everybody loses because the agency's demotivated, you don't get the greatest work out of them. So the good news is that there is another way to work. And again, I got 3 ideas for you here on how to make this process of running the pitch a little bit smoother. And the first one is to provide feedback. And this might seem obvious, but when the agency calls you up and they want feedback on their ideas, go ahead and give them feedback on some of the ideas. This is an opportunity for you to refine the ideas, to see how they respond to feedback, which gets into the second point, which is to act as if they're already hired. So treat them as if this is your agency. Not only so you can kind of understand what it's like to work with them, but so that you can be fully immersed in what it will be like to have them as a partner. So go spend time at their agency. Go meet their stakeholders that are going to be weighing in on their decisions on their end. So you can kind of see what it's like to be on their side of the table. And the only way you can do that is if you act as if they've already been hired. Now, this is very time consuming, which is why a lot of people don't do it. But if you do it, the agency oftentimes appreciates it, and you get a better picture of what it's going to really be like to work with them. And then the final piece is to respect their time. And what I mean by that specifically is if you're running a pitch process, to do whatever you can to start and end the process at the same time for all the agencies. Get back to them in a timely fashion. Have everybody come with their ideas, ideally within the same week, so that you can respond to everybody right away. On the flip side of this, respecting their time also means sharing tough news the moment you know you aren't going to work with an agency. So I've seen situations where a team knows they don't want to work with an agency, but they keep on letting them carry on in the pitch process. And what I've found works better is just the moment you know it's not working, just to cut it off, because they're investing a lot of time and energy, and they will appreciate knowing that news earlier rather than later. Okay, so you best to respect their time and work in a collaborative way, be available, and provide them with feedback. Okay, so then you've gone through the briefing process and you've gone through the pitch process. Now it comes time to do the work. So hooray, you've hired the agency and maybe you've gone out to drinks and everybody's really enthusiastic, everybody's really excited to get started. And what happens is there can be the situation where the clients again get a little bit lazy. So one of the issues that comes up is you could leave them to solve an impossible puzzle. And by that I mean you thought you sent a problem for them to solve in the brief. Now you're going to send all your problems over to the agency and see if they can fix these things that nobody on your brand team has been able to figure out for the past few years. And so you leave them to try to solve these impossible puzzles, and by that I mean maybe you were briefing them on a particular digital execution, and now you want that digital execution to be rolled across in a through-the-line campaign, across TV and print and a PR campaign, so you change things on them a little bit. Maybe you told them that this was about reach, and now you want it to be about frequency. So it's kind of leaving them to kind of do too many things to solve an impossible puzzle. So that's kind of one tendency. The other tendency is there's this tendency to kind of have the project continue to be this endless audition. So every meeting that the agency comes to, it's like they're constantly having to reprove themselves to you. Now you've already made the decision to bring them on board, and so I've seen situations where the agency constantly feels like they're on the defensive, like they're having to prove everything they say, almost like they're going through the pitch process again. And again, that's extremely demotivating to the agencies. And then finally, this is a big one. How many of you have ever had a situation where either you or someone on your team has changed a brief on an agency? This never happens, right? No, okay, so a few kind of tentative hands there. So you change the brief, you change the objectives, you change what you're trying to accomplish. You change the scope. Oftentimes the scope increases without an increase in the budget. So all of these things can end up happening. And I guess I equate it to kind of a situation where you're kind of raising the bar also. So you might have had a certain metric for success, but suddenly that metric has gone way higher, and now you have this unattainable goal that the agencies are trying to achieve, and that's demotivating because that's not what they signed up to do. Okay, so this reminds me kind of if you go to a restaurant and if you put in an order, and let's say you order, I don't know, the pasta with meatballs, and the chefs are in the kitchen cooking away, and right when they're bringing out the dish, you tell them, oh, you know what, by the way, I forgot to tell you, actually I've got some vegetarians at the table, and so could you kind of remake that dish, and by the way, I'm allergic to all spices, but can you make the dish and still make it taste tasty? This is the equivalent of bringing in additional stakeholders along the way who all have differing views and different requirements. And then what happens is the agency goes back and they try to kind of fix things and take things out and kind of modify things. And then what happens is the food comes out. And suddenly you're shocked that it's not what you had in mind, that it doesn't taste good, that it doesn't resemble anything that you thought it was going to resemble. And this happens a lot. So the question is, why is this an issue? Well, the issue here is because everyone, again, loses, and you won't make any progress on your projects. You're going to constantly be going around in circles. You're going to be constantly reworking things. You're going to constantly be spending more money and more time than you really want to be. The good news, once again, is there is an alternative approach. And again, I've got 3 ideas here for you. So the first is kind of similar to before, is just to be available as needed. So similar to the pitch process, to be involved with the project, to respond to the account manager when they've got questions, to go and spend time with the creative team if necessary. It really comes down to investing time in it. And I've seen some of the best client-side managers are the ones who treat their agency relationships as one of their priority projects. And if you don't do that, you just won't get as much out of the agency. The second is kind of a paradigm shift of the agency works for us to the agency works with us. And this is kind of that shift in the agency going from being a supplier to a true strategic partner. And how that plays out in practice is this means pre-briefing and kind of pre-aligning before any sort of sell-in meetings with your client-side stakeholders. It means making sure that they understand what some of the key hot-button issues are within your company that they might want to factor in as they develop the creative, any sensitivities. It can mean something as simple as when you show up to a meeting, sitting on the same side of the table as the creatives that are presenting, so that you don't have all the clients on one side and all the creatives on the other side. Again, going back to that audition mentality. But I've found that even just changing where you sit on the table completely changes the dynamic in the room, where you're jointly presenting, and you know exactly what the creative team is going to be sharing with your stakeholders. Okay, so that's the other shift I'd encourage you to make. And then the final one is to not change your order. And I know that internal requirements change, or especially with real-time marketing, you get new information coming in and you're going to have to adjust your brief sometimes. But to the extent that you can, I'd encourage you to avoid changing your order, because I've found that when orders change, they just don't end up tasting so good in the end. So those are some ideas on how you can improve the actual work process. I guess I'll wrap up today by just talking about one of my biggest pet peeves. I think both as a client, I've been spending a lot of time talking about clients, but I'll also share one about agencies. So first, let's start with the client. So on the client side, I think one of my biggest pet peeves, and something I hear a lot when I roll into a new team, is let's say an ad didn't go very well, or a digital campaign didn't end up working out as they had hoped. A phrase I've heard a lot is, well, it was in the execution. That's where it fell over. The strategy was great, but it was in the execution that things didn't work out. It's another way of kind of saying, well, it's the agency's fault that this didn't work out. And as far as I know, most client-side brand managers are involved in the pre-production meeting. They're signing off on all the creative, they're signing off on all the props, all the copy, all the mock-ups, the storyboards. If it's an ad, you're meeting with the producers, you're meeting with the directors. You should be involved for most of the project and along most of the progress. So this idea of something coming back that you weren't sure was going to come back in that way, I've always found that a bit perplexing, because if you are being involved, if you are being collaborative, that shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be surprises. On the flip side, I think my biggest pet peeve when it comes to agencies is those agencies that don't take the feedback on board. So if I'm taking the time to provide that feedback to an agency, my expectation is that they're going to take that on board, they're going to hear what I have to say, and to adjust accordingly. So that, in summary, is kind of what I wanted to talk about today, and my challenge to you is to try to shift things around, to go from a mentality of a client team and an agency team to a true joint client-agency team, one that's a true partnership, one where you are strategically and jointly owning and presenting and being held accountable for things, where it's not kind of you and them, but kind of one unified team. That'd be my challenge to you. And so just to kind of wrap up, just make sure that the brief is clear, make sure that the pitch is respectful, and the work is collaborative. And I think if you do these three things, you'll find that you're able to transform your traditional client-agency relationships into these true strategic partnerships and ultimately drive the business results that you're looking for. And with that, I will wrap up with 2 words that I think are also very useful to share with agencies, not only when you finish the project, but every step along the way, which is thank you. And that's it. So with that, I also thought I'd just mention that I do coaching for people related to career development. So if you feel like it would ever be useful for you or someone from your team to learn more about how to manage your agencies effectively, how to present effectively, or how to make the most of your personal brand and leverage that, then I would love to hear from you. I love coaching people individually and also teams. So feel free to drop me a note, and I'd be happy to try and help. And I think we're going to take some questions, and then we've got a thought question for you to consider at your tables afterwards.
Exactly. You're doing my job for me. So yes, we do have that. So first of all, before we go into the discussions, do we have any questions for Joseph? Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, there is. You can shout loudly. Let me bring it over. There we go.
Thank you. Interesting little presentation. I'm an ex-agency and ex-head of marketing as well. So, but the two elements of the internal picture that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is, first of all, procurement.
Procurement.
The role of procurement. And secondly, increasingly, the role of IT and the IT department in marketing decisions and the role of procurement in marketing decisions, and especially the relationship with the agency. This week I had to get a lot of website stuff done. I had to rely on the IT team to speak very closely with the agency. So in effect, the relationship is not only owned by marketing anymore.
Right. Okay. So on the procurement piece, was there a specific element of procurement that you wanted to cover? Just kind of broadly speaking, how to get the procurement team involved, or just the process?
Procurement increasingly have in a corporate, procurement have very strict guidelines in terms of the pitch process. And and how much of that is, a lot of it is taken outside of marketing's control. And who works within the marketing team, you know this, is procurement and finance have increasingly more control over the agency selection process.
Right. So that's a great question, because I think the point, for those of you who maybe didn't hear the question, so procurement's taking an increasing role in getting agencies on board, either for legal requirements or just to stick with the corporate policy of how you bring agencies on board. I remember one brand I worked on, we weren't actually allowed to go off independently and try to procure our own agencies. It had to go through the corporate team. That is a really tough situation. I think this tends to be more of an issue in large organizations, and I think my best response to that is you've got to find some way to work with them. And I think that one way to do it is to actually bring them on board from the very start, maybe not to every meeting, but just to make sure that you have solicited their viewpoints and that you convince them that either you're going to represent those views, or I try to avoid this, have them come along to the meeting so they can kind of serve as a bit of a quote-unquote watchdog. And I would say that it's really important, as much of a pain as it is to get them involved really early. Because what I've seen happen sometimes is that you don't get them involved until later, and you've gotten so far down the process because you've been kind of trying to dodge them. And there's no way to dodge the procurement team. So I would bring them in early. I would make sure that you're following whatever rules that they want you to follow. But at the same time, I've also been in a situation where I've done kind of the official briefing that follows all the corporate templates. And then I've kind of pulled the agency aside and said, hey, you know what? Can I do another little briefing with you of how I would capture this if I were to capture this brief in my own words? And I've definitely done that. Now, your second question, you just have to remind me, what was your second question again? The role of IT. Okay, so the other thing that's coming up right now is that, especially in the digital marketing space, you're having to get these kind of internal experts involved in the process. I would say that it's actually a very similar situation to procurement, and that is to have them involved early on, but I think what's also useful is to make it clear who owns what decisions. So maybe you've got the IT department and they're going to be signing off on making sure that this agency you're bringing on board has the technical capabilities that'll be able to work within your systems. But at the end of the day, maybe you agree that actually as the brand team, we're going to have the final say amongst those that meet your requirements of which ones we feel are going to be most suitable for our requirements. So I think part of it's bringing them on board earlier, part of it's kind of being very clear about the decision-making hierarchy and who owns which decision, if you can, and trying to delineate that as early as possible so that you don't end up butting heads later. So it is very tricky. It's very tricky, but it's better to at least try to have the conversation than to kind of not make it clear at all. So it's just better to know what you're working with. But it's tricky. That's a very complicated situation, coming up a lot more right now.
Excellent, thank you, Joe. Anybody else have another question for Joseph? Yep.
Yeah.
So have you got any advice from agency side on approaching that type of a bad brief from a client and how tactically you could transform a bad situation into a good one agency side?
Yeah, that's a, okay, so the question was, what happens if you're on the agency side and you receive a really horrible brief? How can you, in kind of a tactful, diplomatic way, feed that back to the client? The truth of the matter is that's a very touchy situation because a lot of times, just kind of on the last point, the company's so used to briefing a certain way, and I've found that clients, well, I've been a client most of my life, you kind of get used to doing things one way and you forget that there's another way to do it unless you've kind of worked at multiple companies. And so I think one thing that I really valued, just kind of putting myself back in the shoes where I have had an agency come back and give me feedback on something, was to just kind of pull me aside and kind of one-on-one tell me, hey, this isn't working. Because a lot of times it's harder to do that in a group setting because either my boss is there who really likes to see this brief delivered with this template, or we have other kind of issues going on where we don't have the latitude to kind of flex how we brief people. So I've always found it's useful if somebody either gives me a call or kind of pulls me aside one-on-one where I don't have to be kind of towing the party line and have a conversation about, hey, this isn't that inspiring for the creatives, this isn't going to work. Is there any other way that you can kind of bring this to life? Is there anything that we can do in addition to this meeting to kind of get the creatives a little bit more excited? So I think it's just about having the honest conversation and kind of at the right moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Ultimately, it's still going to have a fundamental effect on the success of the project.
Yeah.
Primarily from the client side, it's important also from agency side, I guess, to make sure that relationship from their point of view is also the same.
Absolutely. I was just catching up with someone I know last night who used to work at EDB, and one of the things that she told me, because I was getting some of her thoughts to feed into this presentation, was one of the pitfalls that she sees in the agency side and the client side is when people get really emotional with things. And the creative process is an inherently emotional process. Like you've got creatives who are coming up with these ideas that are kind of their babies. And she kind of pointed out to me that the moment it becomes really emotional, it becomes very, very difficult to have a conversation about it because people start digging their heels in and not wanting to budge. So to the extent that you can kind of remove emotion from it, I would try to do it. Easier said than done.
Wonderful, thank you. Jamie Gerok, have I pronounced your surname correctly, wherever you might be in the audience, tweeted, which I agree with, I'm sure you guys will on my behalf. Joseph, that was visually brilliant and your presentation was fantastic. So thank you very much indeed.